I would like to introduce Ritu Kapur and Raju Narisetti, our speakers for this session. Ritu is the CEO and co-founder of the Quint. Prior to this, she used to head programming at History Channel and was the features editor at CNN IBM, where she launched the popular Citizen Journalist show, among other things. Raju Narisetti's current role as leader global publishing at McKinsey and Company is the latest in a 32-year global career in media and publishing, during which he has created, reimagined, and managed major media organizations in North America, Europe, and Asia. Raju has also worked at the Wall Street Journal, News Corp, and Gizmodo Media Group. I request the audience to post their questions for the speakers in the Q&A box. And now I request Ritu to take the stage. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Neha. And great to be in conversation with you, Raju. I'm hoping to have plenty of takeaways in this quick half an hour. So let me just quickly say where we are at, where I think where we are at. So the pandemic happened, for good or for bad. It helped us as digital publishers because consumers moved to digital. With it, to some significant extent, advertisers started looking at digital that much more significantly. We also saw a bump globally in reader revenue, and now we're seeing a plateauing of reader revenue to some extent. We're seeing that while the ad dollar has moved to digital, newsrooms, because tech has not been a favorite playground for news publishers. We take our content very, very seriously. We lost out to big tech by just not looking at tech for so many years. So the question is, do we have enough to offer to advertisers where consumption is on the tiny mobile screen, where conventionally real estate is limited? So just wanted to get, in this half hour, pick your mind on what do you think, from where you are looking at us, what do you think are the biggest challenges that we are really looking at, and what are the spaces that we should be looking at for solutions?
Thanks, Ritu. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And I just want to give a couple of caveats up front. I have not been personally in the news business for a few years now. I follow it very closely. And I'm also speaking mostly here in my personal capacity because my McKinsey role doesn't have a lot to do with newsrooms. Having said that, I think one other thing happened during the pandemic, and correct me if I'm misreading it, which is, I think for a long time, Indian media companies, especially mainstream media companies, believed in the idea that while the West is seeing significant structural changes, significant decline in print in particular, and fragmentation, that India is somehow going to be different, and that it's going to take a much longer time for India to feel a lot of these issues. But I think the pandemic has really accelerated that gap that perhaps India felt like it had between what's happening in the West in media and what's happening in India. And I think now it's a lot closer. It feels a lot more real, that some of the challenges that globally media is facing are also the challenges that Indian media are facing, right? I mean, just yesterday, some new data came out in the US that talked about newspaper circulation numbers. For a country of 300 million people, we now have only 9 newspapers in the US with more than 100,000 circulation. Just 9 newspapers. Pretty shocking, right? I mean, how quickly that has happened. So in many ways, I think while it feels like the newspaper business in particular is doing okay, the competition in English, the inability to really raise a lot of revenue in terms of advertising prices in vernacular, and the fact that during the pandemic, so many people switched out of newspapers and probably are never going to come back, has, I think, created a bit of a perfect storm in Indian media as well. So that brings to this question that you are posing about where do we go from here? And is the digital pie, is the digital opportunity big enough for everybody? And what are some of the trends? There are a couple of things that I want to just raise as things to think about, and I don't know if newsrooms are doing that. One is, I think, this idea that the amount of data that we have access to in digital is also dramatically shrinking as the likes of Apple and others put in place significant privacy options for users. So increasingly, our ability to kind of know who the audience is and then be able to turn around and understand their content behavior, and more importantly, understand their relationship with advertising is shrinking. So this idea that we could rely on cookies and we would know a lot about the audience and then we were able to sell them is becoming a real challenge. So I think the most successful organizations, whether it's in the West or in India, will increasingly be organizations that have a first-party data relationship with their audience. And meaning that either you have to have subscriptions, you have to be able to kind of get them to sign up for emails or alerts and tell you who they are and have that relationship directly. And I think not investing in that is going to cause significant challenges, even with digital advertising, even with programmatic advertising. At McKinsey, we estimate that close to $10 billion in normal advertising revenue is at risk unless you begin to accumulate first-party data. And how do you do that? How do you convince audiences that are very skeptical of what you will do with their data? What is the value that you will offer in return for getting my email or getting my address or knowing who I am? I think is important for media to start thinking very hard about. And I'm not sure that enough people are doing that anywhere in the world, but those like the New York Times or others who have had subscriptions for a while, I think are in the driver's seat. I mean, even in India in the last few years, there's a lot more digital subscriptions that are starting to happen, but the scale is still pretty small. So that's one. Two, I think because of the emphasis on costs, a lot of the applications of AI and kind of those kind of tools are still very much focused on the cost cutting side of it, as opposed to kind of saying, can we use some of these tools to improve our journalism, to improve our storytelling, to better understand how audiences might be reacting to our content and being able to kind of then take advantage of that. And then the final piece, I think this is the real missing piece. So many of us in journalism, whether we are on the business side or whether we are on the newsroom side, spend so much of our time and energy focused on content, which we should, right? I mean, that's the core product anyway. I'm not sure we are connecting the dots between the data we are trying to get about people's readership habits, all of that, and then being able to connect that to the advertising data. I don't think we've made enough investments to make those two connections, which I think long-term will be a real problem. And so I think those are a few areas that I can think of. And then I'm sure there are lots of the bigger issues, right? Declining trust and kind of what demographics is doing, aging audiences for a certain kind of television or certain kind of newsprint. Maybe India doesn't have an age challenge simply because it's such a young country, right? So in that, from a demographics point of view, there's maybe a bigger opportunity, but a lot of them are the TikTok generation as opposed to, reading words generation, right? So how do you bridge those gaps? So those are issues that I think need to be talked about in a more meaningful way.
This is while you were talking, there was a million questions coming up to me. So the buzzword now, and we've all been talking about it, is to get consumer centric as against content centric, and newsrooms have been traditionally, but there's a lot. It's easier said than done. It's not just an attitude shift, right? Because there's number one is we're all looking, latest Reuters digital report shows us how trust in media, news media has further declined. So this relationship, spot on when you're saying first party data is currently, the winners are going to be those with first party data, and first party data with deep relationships with the consumer, with the reader. But so the first question becomes, what do you do to bring trust back? Because that is core to actually building news businesses. Because eventually, if it's reader revenue, first party data, reader revenue, then I need to give the readers a reason to trust what I'm doing. And second, I need to clearly give the readers something that they will get nowhere else. Why will they pay me or share their personal data or their email IDs? Or, if I don't have something unique to offer them. So that's the second concern. So there's trust, there is quality of content. And the third question that hounds me currently is the level of tech, really quality tech and tech talent that I need to be able to move from being content centric to consumer centric, to be able to join the dots, like you said, very importantly, between user data and ad revenue. There's actually a lot of, because I fight this battle every day. So these are the three things that came up to me, which is tech, content, and trust.
Yeah. So let's take the trust piece first, right? And again, I think there is a tendency on our part to kind of look at trust as, do people believe in media and do people kind of trust media? And I think the Reuters report that came out recently, which focused on India, kind of talked about, which brands are trusted and which are not. And it was ironic to me that Republic TV, high engagement, high audience, was that kind of, in a sense, at the low end of trust, right? And weirdly or interestingly, The Wire was very similar. It was like near the bottom of like, do I believe it or not, right? So it's interesting, the correlation between trust and actual use cases and actual audience engagement. But I actually still go back to this idea that we need to start looking at trust in terms of data, right? So if you look at how do we, I think we call it like DRM, the data relationship management, and typically tends to have four pieces to it, right? One is this idea of data invitation, which is, what is the invitation you give somebody to share data, right? And I think that's something to think about. The second idea is like this idea of a transparent data security center, where you tell your audiences, if you give me something, this is what I will do to protect it. This is what I will do not to sell it. This is what I will do not to spam you with by 1,000 other people using your email because I've sold it to them. The third thing is that this nature of like a dialogue in terms of what is the value exchange you will get if you give me an email, if you give me a piece of information. So that's, I think, the value proposition idea. For example, we have found that offers and discounts are one option that companies could consider in the data invitation. Almost 57% of customers in surveys express excitement around receiving discounts or offers in exchange for the use of their data, right? So is there a value proposition if you're a media company? Obviously, most media companies, the thing they can give you is information, right? So let's take McKinsey, for example. We have the McKinsey Quarterly. It's been around for 58 years. It's a very unique thing. You can't buy it. It goes to about 30,000 CEOs. I potentially have the opportunity now to say, if you give me your email, if you tell me what company you work at, if you tell me your title, if you tell me how many people you manage, if you tell me if you're a decision maker, I would give you access to an e-edition of the McKinsey Quarterly that nobody else can get. You can't even buy it in the market, right? Because it's a controlled circulation product. So do you have, as a media company, do you have anything like that where you can offer it in return for getting that information? And then be very, very honest and truthful about that. I won't sell your information. I will use it to make you more informed. Since we target business executives, our premise is we actually give you a lot of insights that are tailored to you if you tell us what kind of interests you have, right? If you're in sales and marketing, we don't want to send you an operations email, right? The only way we can personalize it for you is if you tell us that. So I think that value proposition still exists. The other thing, again, when it comes to data, and I'm as you can see, I'm trying to kind of connect the content piece to the revenue piece here. I think this whole idea of contextual advertising is going to become a lot bigger. And by that, I mean, not necessarily what the 10 sites you are going to and trying to target you through third-party stuff like Facebook tends to do, but to really say, if you're on Quint, what section are you in? And what seems to be the kind of things where you spend your time? And I think there are now enough advances in technology and tools where in relatively real time, I can say, hey, Raju seems to be mostly in our economics section. Why don't I show him related advertising that makes sense? So for example, if you and I are working out at a gym, Ritu, if the TV is on, we are much more inclined to look at something and perhaps even make a purchase decision if it's about products around nutrition, products around like health, right? So that contextual advertising, I think, is becoming much more real now for us. So the question is, can I take this reader who I know is hanging out on my economics page, and can I also know enough to be able to target with it an economics related ad? So I think that's the nature of the relationship that we need to invest in right now, rather than try to keep this church and state idea around data as well, right? So that's something I don't think most organizations are thinking, because the ad sales people are doing their own thing. The content people are doing their own thing. Each one is collecting a fair amount of data. And I'm not sure we are connecting those dots and making that. And this ties into your question about like, how do we invest in technology, and how do we attract people, right? The reality, Ritu, is that I think other than journalists and circulation people, unique to our industry, we have never been good at attracting great salespeople. Most newsroom HR people are pretty terrible, I think, right? So a lot of those things were not great. But there is a group of people in the technology world who do actually want to be associated with news, want to be kind of part of content. And at the Washington Post, many, many years ago, when I was the managing editor, one of the things we did was, when we submitted our articles for prizes, when we put bylines, we started actually giving bylines to the front-end, back-end developers, crediting them, because they've built the interactives, so that gave a sense of significant pride. And we found that there was a certain kind of developer who was much more interested in applying to the Washington Post than applying to Google and making 3 times more money. The other thing I don't think we have done, I think the Times of India group actually does this pretty well, creating a lot of relationships with technology institutions, creating fellowships, creating technology internship programs. Most of us have done a lot of newsroom internships, right? Because again, that's where our mind is, but not really thinking about, should we be engaging like the engineering schools, the software schools, and bringing those people into our newsrooms, exposing them to the fact that, it's a very glamorous thing for a lot of people who are not in the news business, right? So I don't think we are taking advantage of some of the strengths our industry has in solving for that particular issue on how do we hire good technologists.
I completely agree. I mean, to your point about, that's what we've started doing, that in our immersives and interactives, we make sure that the developers and the tech minds and the UI UX designers, their credits are really high up there. But I think even more so, I think it's really important now in newsrooms for people like me who are managing the newsroom, and even more so for senior editors to equip themselves with understanding how digital content creation, storytelling, AI, new forms, new formats, they work, because only then will they be able to create an environment in the newsroom where they're challenging the tech talent. Because if the tech talent doesn't get a challenge, and if they're talking to a news editor on a story type where the news editor doesn't have enough insight into what tech can do, then I start seeing the interest drop. So right. So that is really, really important. Before I just go into some of the participants' questions that have come in, and we don't have too much time, I just wanted to ask you, how important is it to look at the cost of running newsrooms at a time when, yes, ad dollars are moving to digital, but it's still a small pie after, what's left for us after Google, Facebook, Amazon, and OTTs take their bits. It's a small little pie. So while revenue is going up, reader revenue is going up, but it's plateauing, how important is it to look at costs?
I mean, whether we think it's important or not, the reality is that I think most newsrooms are already doing it, right? Kind of trying to right size a newsroom and reduce some costs, because the largest cost centers tend to be newsrooms. The point I think like some of us tend to forget is when we look at who are the most successful, again, let's take the US market, which news brands are now the most successful digitally. Most of us will have to say it's the New York Times, it's the Wall Street Journal, it's the Washington Post. The one common thing, Ritu, among those and the rest of the people is they have actually not significantly cut back on the newsroom. If anything, each of these organizations has the biggest newsrooms in like 20, 30 years than right now. Because they do realize, I think there is significant value in trying to kind of create compelling products. The big, I think, difference for us is we have to kind of say, are there things we can stop doing? And are there things that we can double down on rather than try to do everything a little bit and try to cut? Because when you're into programmatic world, when you're into trying to drive impressions, your philosophy is that let me try to do everything so people will come and I'll serve them an ad. But that's not a relationship building process, right? We have long believed that if we have great content, that is enough. The problem with that is the competitive advantage of great content is now a matter of minutes, right? Meaning that you write a really good story and you publish it. Within 5 minutes, people are creating rabbit holes and drawing away audiences that because of like they're either doing a curation, they're like kind of jumping on what you did. So good content has become table stakes. But what brings people back is this idea of creating an experience layer on top of that content. So let's say like the US Supreme Court decision on abortion, everybody has the same story. So how do you kind of bring people back to you is if you can create like an interactive, if you can say what states it's now impossible, what states is possible, where are the laws, and that interactive is you can plug in your zip code and say, how far do you have to go now to maybe get to a clinic, right? So if you had that, then people will say, you know what, that was more useful for me than reading the same article here versus anywhere else. So that experience layer is where I think, to your point, a lot of editors are still not thinking about. They're still thinking about what is the best article I can write on this issue without realizing that everybody's writing that article and there's no competitive advantage to that anymore. So I think that's where the idea that you can create a layer of experience that is unique to Quint, unique to Times of India or Hindustan Times on a story that everybody is doing. That's where you can still differentiate. And I think that's where you can create value. And if you create that, then you can bring people back. And if you bring people back, chances that they will give you their data is much higher.
Right.
So it's like a virtuous loop almost.
Right. And then, of course, there's no time for us to get into that existential question on how to monetize video, but I'll quickly jump to a couple of questions that have come in from people attending this session. Like you said, between user data and ad revenue, what are the possibilities? So what are your thoughts for offering a pay-per-content to complement the reader revenue effort? So
pay-per-content meaning that to actually pay by article? Is that what they're like? Is that
I'm guessing so. I can tell you that our experience is that it's a bad idea, but I'll let you weigh in.
Yeah, it's for a couple of reasons, it's a challenging idea, right? One is the micropayment thing. Unless you have your own payment system, you're still paying somebody to do the transaction. So you're like, even if somebody's paying 10 rupees per article, you're still giving somebody a piece of that. So that's one challenge. So the money you're making may not, and some people have like done tip jars, right? The idea that like, if you like something, just give us, certain amount as a tip. The Guardian almost functions that way, right? We're not charging you anything to read it, but it costs us a lot of money. Please give us some money. That might work on an emotional basis, and it does work. The Guardian, I think, is actually succeeding with that. The part that worries me about that is, how do you decide the value of a story? And in kind of setting a price per story, you're actually sending the wrong signal to people, saying that this story is worth this much versus this story. And you're actually perhaps kind of sending the signal that the real costs of journalism translated into an actual per article is kind of devaluing what it takes to do good journalism. So I worry about that long-term signaling effect as well. But it's possible to try. We, at the Washington Post, again, a long time ago, we almost thought we'll put a tip jar. But for us, there's a lot of IRS, like tax revenue implications for a for-profit company to take donations. So it's a lot of interesting challenges there, I think, to think about. But the good news is, none of this has to be, the wheel doesn't have to be invented. Everybody has tried every single thing somewhere. So there's a lot of data now on what works and what doesn't. Right. I think that the puzzle for me in India is like, nobody seems to have really cracked the 1 million paid subs and above. So how scalable is the paid subs model is an interesting question for me that I don't have a lot of answers to. But it's something to think about, whether there is a ceiling and what will it take to break through that ceiling.
Right. I think we have maybe time for one more question. Did US newspapers do anything to change the situation of less than 9 newspapers with large circulation? Do they want to?
Would they like to? Absolutely, right? Because the margins on print are still pretty decent, right? But are they, can they? I doubt it, right? The trend is fairly one way, and it continues to be in decline. My sense is there will always be a core group of older print readers who will pay a lot of money to get that print product. And because of the demographics and because of the spending power of those people, there'll still be a lot of advertisers wanting to reach them. But it's no longer a scale game. And it becomes like, my sense is 100,000, 200. Eventually, my sense is that even the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post will get down to 150, 200,000 print subs. But this will be core people who are willing to pay $1,000 per year to get it. And so it'll make good money, but it's no longer this engine that drives something. And it becomes a little bit like a nice vanity thing to have, is my sense. It may take a lot longer in India to get to that point, but I don't think the trend is going to be very different here.
Right. Neha, I don't think we have time for another question, right? Or do we?
I think we're just about done.
Oh, okay. I mean, we could have, I have 1,000 questions, and there are a couple of questions more that we couldn't address, but thank you so much, Raju. This was, I've made some furious notes for myself. I'm sure there's been a lot that other people have had to take away from this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and thanks to WAN-IFRA, Neha, and Ritu. Thanks again. I always enjoy talking to you, and hopefully it gives people some ideas on what to kind of at least think about.
Yeah, I hope to meet you in person somewhere soon and get off these virtual sessions.
Look forward to it as well.
Thanks
so much.
Raju.
Thanks, everyone.
Before we move to the next session, I want to take a minute to thank our sponsors, our platinum, silver, and bronze sponsors, Google News Initiative, Piano Media, who also sponsored this session, and Chartbeat. And now I request the audience to go back to the timeline and join the CEO panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.